It's the night of April 3rd, 1941. At RAF Mildenhall, a Wellington bomber stands ready on the dispersal pad. The Suffolk moon catches the faint sheen of its fabric-covered frame. Inside, squadron leader James Ward and his 5-man crew are running through their pre-flight checks. They move with a practiced rhythm, a familiar dance they've performed 23 times before. After 8 months of flying together, they're a well-oiled machine. The routine is always the same. Load the bombs, a mix of incendiaries and high explosives. Cross the dark, cold expanse of the North Sea. Find the target. Release the payload. And then, the most important part, return home. Tonight's destination is Bremen, a vital industrial port for Germany. The briefing was promising. Intelligence reports suggested that the city's anti-aircraft defences, the dreaded flak batteries, had been temporarily weakened to support operations elsewhere. On paper, it looked like a straightforward mission. But there was something the briefing didn't cover. Something that was a constant source of debate within RAF Bomber Command itself. It wasn't about the mission, the target, or the weather. It was about the very aircraft Ward and his crew were about to fly into the heart of enemy territory. The Vickers Wellington had become the workhorse of Britain's night bombing campaign. But among the pilots, especially those used to the solid feel of all-metal aircraft, it was a source of serious controversy. The problem wasn't the powerful Pegasus engines, nor was it the defensive machine guns. The real debate was about its skin. While American and German bombers like the B-17 and the Heinkel 111 gleamed with modern stressed metal construction, the Wellington was different. It was wrapped in Irish linen, stretched tight over a bizarre basket-weave metal framework. To many, it looked less like a frontline bomber and more like a giant flying greenhouse, a fragile kite. The man behind this radical design was an engineering genius named Barnes Wallis. He had spent years trying to sell his unconventional geodetic airframe to a skeptical air ministry. He explained time and again how the interlocking lattice of lightweight metal beams would distribute stress and damage across the entire structure. This network of intersecting supports meant that if one part was damaged, others would automatically take up the load. It made the aircraft incredibly strong and resilient, far more so than its fabric skin suggested. On paper, the theory was brilliant. It promised an aircraft that was both lightweight and phenomenally tough. But in the real world, theory and practice can feel very different. Every time a pilot saw those fabric panels rippling and flexing in the wind during takeoff, a seed of doubt was planted. Were they climbing into a state-of-the-art weapon or a flying death? Squadron leader Ward, however, wasn't one of the doubters. He had seen the proof with his own eyes. Back in February, during a raid over Wilhelmshaven, his Wellington had taken a direct hit from a flak shell. The explosion had torn a hole in the port wing so massive you could have crawled through it. Any other aircraft would have been torn apart, spiralling out of control. But his Wellington, it barely shuddered. The geodetic frame held the aircraft flew home as steady as if it were gliding on rails, carrying its crew back to safety. That experience had made a believer out of Ward. He trusted his aircraft implicitly. Still, he understood the fear. He knew why some crews desperately tried to get transfers to squadrons flying the Handley-Page-Hampden or the Armstrong-Whitworth-Whitley. Those bombers felt solid. They felt like flying fortresses. The Wellington to them felt like a flying linen kite, waiting for the first gust of wind or burst of flak to tear it to shreds. As the crew finished their checks, the ground crew gave the final thumbs up. The two massive Pegasus engines coughed to life, their roar shattering the nighttime quiet of the English countryside. The Wellington trembled, eager to get into the air. Ward throttled up, and the bomber began its rumbling journey down the runway. Inside the cockpit, the familiar ritual of takeoff unfolded. Gauges were checked. Controls were tested. For Ward's crew, this was just another night at the office. But across Britain, at dozens of other airfields, hundreds of other young men were climbing into their own Wellingtons. For them, the debate was far from over. They were betting their lives on Barnes-Wallace's strange design. They were flying into the dark, trusting that a frame of metal and a skin of fabric would be enough to see them through the night and bring them home again. The Wellington was an aircraft born from a unique engineering philosophy. While other nations pursued brute strength through heavy metal plates, Britain, with its more limited resources, had to innovate. Barnes-Wallace's geodetic structure was a masterclass in efficiency, achieving incredible strength without the weight penalty of traditional designs. This meant the Wellington could carry a heavier bomb load for a longer distance than many of its contemporaries. Think of it like a wicker basket. A single strand of wicker is weak and easily broken, but when you weave hundreds of them together into an interlocking pattern, the basket becomes incredibly strong and can carry heavy loads. Wallace applied this same principle to an aircraft frame. The crisscrossing aluminum alloy beams created a structure that could absorb and redistribute immense stress. If a few beams were shot away, the rest of the network would simply take over the load, keeping the wing or fuselage intact. This resilience was legendary. There are countless stories of Wellingtons returning to base with astonishing levels of damage. Wings peppered with so many holes they looked like Swiss cheese, fuselages with huge sections of fabric and even structural members torn away. In one famous case, a Wellington lost almost its entire rear turret and tail section to a night fighter's cannons. Yet the pilot was still able to fly it back to England and land it safely. This survivability gave crews who understood the design immense confidence. They knew their Wimpy, as it was affectionately nicknamed, could take a beating and still get them home. But convincing new crews of this was always a challenge. When you're 20 years old, flying into a sky filled with explosive shells and enemy fighters, you want to feel like you're encased in armor, not cloth. The psychological impact was real. The noise of the wind whistling through torn fabric. The sight of daylight streaming through holes in the fuselage could be terrifying. It took a special kind of courage and a deep trust in the engineering to fly a Wellington mission after mission. So, as Ward's aircraft lifted off from Mildenhall and set its course for Bremen, it represented more than just a single bomber on a single raid. It was a symbol of a larger conflict not just between nations, but between competing ideas of engineering, courage, and survival. It was a testament to the idea that strength doesn't always come from sheer mass, but from intelligent design and an intricate, interconnected system. Every crew that flew the Wellington became part of this story. They were the human element in a grand experiment, proving night after night that Barnes-Wallis' flying greenhouse was one of the toughest and most effective weapons of the war. Their legacy is a reminder that sometimes the most unconventional ideas can turn out to be the most resilient. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories from the age of aviation. We'll see you in the next one. At 9 in the evening, the engines of the Wellington bomber coughed to life. Their deep, familiar rumble was a comforting sound, powerful enough to drown out the last traces of anxiety that always lingered before a mission. Just a few minutes later, the pilot, Ward, had the bomber rolling down the runway. He could feel the tail lift, that exhilarating moment when the wheels finally left English soil behind. They climbed steadily into the vast darkness, merging into the stream of bombers all heading east, a river of steel and courage flowing towards the heart of enemy territory. As soon as they crossed the coast, every navigation light blinked off. From that point on, until they hopefully returned, they were completely alone. The night sky, while beautiful, was a hunting ground. They were sharing it with German night fighters, predators specifically designed to find and destroy bombers, just like theirs. The Wellington was a unique aircraft designed by a man named Barnes-Wallis. His big idea was the geodetic airframe, a lattice-like structure that looked almost delicate, like a woven basket. Wallis's calculations and all the early tests suggested this design could withstand an incredible amount of damage, far more than conventional bombers. Wind tunnel tests, mathematical models, and static load trials all confirmed it. But there's a world of difference between a laboratory and a war zone. Mathematics and wind tunnels don't shoot back. Tonight, as they flew over the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the Wellington would face the ultimate test, a trial by fire that no lab could ever replicate. This mission would either prove Wallis' vision was genius or confirm the worst fears of sending crews into combat in a plane covered in fabric. The first hint of trouble arrived at 10:45 p.m. They were still about 30 miles from their target, Bremen. Suddenly, the voice of the rear gunner crackled through the intercom. His tone was steady, but you could hear the strain underneath. "Skipper, we've got company. Looks like a 110, 7 o'clock high. A Messerschmitt Bf 110. This was a dedicated night fighter, a deadly opponent." It was likely equipped with the new Liechtenstein radar, which meant it could have been tracking them from over 2 miles away, long before they had any idea it was there. The hunter had found its prey. Ward immediately pushed the Wellington's nose down, putting it into a shallow dive to try and gain some speed. But it was a desperate move. The twin-engine German fighter held all the cards. It was faster, could fly higher, and was far more maneuverable, and its pilot was an expert, someone who had played this deadly game of cat and mouse many times before. The Bf-110 didn't wait long. It opened fire from 600 yards away. A terrifying stream of fire erupted from its nose. For 7.92mm machine guns and 2 powerful 20mm cannons unleashed hell. The cannon shells were especially nasty. They were designed not just to punch holes, but to explode on impact, sending a shower of red-hot razor-sharp fragments tearing through the bomber's structure. At the same time, the machine guns, firing over 1,000 rounds a minute, were designed to slice through vital systems cables, hydraulic lines, and fuel tanks with brutal efficiency. The first impacts felt like a series of violent hammer blows against the fuselage. The sound was deafening, a horrifying mix of tearing fabric and screeching metal. The rear gunner screamed over the intercom that his turret was hit, the Perspex canopy shattering around him. Through the gaping holes in the bomber, the crew could see the tracer rounds, like angry red hornets, zipping past them in the darkness. Inside the fuselage, it was chaos. One of the 20mm shells exploded against a main spar in the right wing. For any other bomber, a direct hit to a main structural element like that would have been catastrophic. The wing would have likely folded, sending the plane into an uncontrollable death spiral. But this was the geodetic Wellington. The lattice frame groaned and twisted under the impact, but it held. Metal and fabric were torn away, leaving a huge, gaping hole, but the wing's overall integrity remained intact. The bomber shuddered violently, but it kept flying. Wallace's theory was holding up, at least for now. But the assault was relentless. Another burst of cannon fire ripped through the belly of the aircraft. This time it found the hydraulic lines. The fluid, essential for controlling the gun turrets and landing gear, began to spray out into the frigid night air. The hydraulic pressure gauge on Ward's panel dropped to 0 in seconds. The front and rear gun turrets, now without power, fell silent. The gunners were still in them, but they could no longer rotate their weapons to fight back. They were now effectively defenseless, relying solely on Ward's skill to evade the attacker. The Bf-110 pilot, seeing the bomber was no longer firing back, grew bolder. He closed the distance, coming in for the kill. He was likely aiming for the engines or the cockpit, the two most vulnerable parts of any bomber. Ward knew he had to do something drastic. He threw the Wellington into a corkscrew, a violent, stomach-churning, evasive maneuver. He banked hard left, dived, then pulled up and banked hard right, repeating the pattern over and over. The goal was to make the bomber's flight path as unpredictable as possible, to throw off the fighter pilot's aim. Inside the aircraft, the crew was being thrown around like rag dolls. Loose equipment flew through the cabin. The noise was a symphony of chaos, the roar of the engines, the scream of the wind through the holes in the fuselage, and the continuous, terrifying chatter of the fighters' guns. But the corkscrew was working. The Bf-110's tracer fire was now whipping past them, missing by inches. The German pilot was struggling to keep a bead on the wildly maneuvering bomber. Then disaster struck again. A stray round from one of the machine guns sliced into the port engine's fuel line. A fine mist of high-octane fuel began to spray over the hot engine casing. In a split second, it ignited. A brilliant orange flame erupted from the left wing, lighting up the night sky and turning the dark interior of the cockpit into a flickering, hellish landscape. The fire alarm blared. "Skipper, port engines on fire." The flight engineer yelled, his voice tight with panic. This was the moment every bomber crew dreaded. An engine fire, especially one fed by a ruptured fuel line, could quickly spread to the wing's fuel tanks. If that happened, the entire wing would explode, and it would be over in an instant. Ward didn't hesitate. He immediately hit the fire extinguisher button for the port engine and feathered the propeller, turning the blade's edge on to the wind to stop it from spinning and reduce drag. The engine sputtered and died. The extinguisher system released a burst of chemicals, and for a heart-stopping moment, the flames seemed to die down. But then, fed by the leaking fuel, they roared back to life, angrier than before. The fire was eating its way along the wing, getting dangerously close to the main fuel tanks. They were flying on borrowed time, seconds away from oblivion. The German pilot, seeing the fire, knew the end was near. He eased off, content to watch his victim burn. There was no need to risk getting too close to an exploding bomber. In that moment of pure desperation, with one engine out and the other wing on fire, a strange calm settled over Ward. The training took over. He knew their only hope, however slim, was to put the fire out, and the only way to do that was to starve it of oxygen. He made a decision that went against every instinct. He put the Wellington into a steep, near-vertical dive. The bomber plunged towards the dark earth below, the airspeed indicator screaming past the red line. The force of the dive pressed the crew deep into their seats. The wind rushing past the crippled airframe became a deafening roar. For a few terrifying seconds, the fire on the wing grew even more intense, fanned by the high-speed descent. But then, just as Wallace's theories predicted the frame could withstand damage, another law of physics came to their aid. The sheer speed and force of the dive began to literally blow the fire out. The flames flickered, sputtered, and then, miraculously, they were gone, leaving behind a trail of black smoke and the charred, skeletal remains of the engine nacelle. Ward pulled back on the yoke with all his strength, fighting to pull the heavy bomber out of its death dive. The geodetic frame groaned under the immense GI forces, but it held together. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose came up and the plane leveled out, just a few thousand feet above the ground. They were alive. They were battered, flying on one engine with massive holes in the fuselage and wing, no hydraulics and no defensive armament. But they were alive. The Bf-110 was gone, having assumed they were a fiery wreck plunging into the ground. They were deep in enemy territory, hundreds of miles from home, in a crippled machine. The mission to Bremen was over. A new mission had just begun: survival. Ward turned the battered Wellington west towards the distant promise of the English coast. The long, lonely flight home had just started. Their ordeal was far from over, but against all odds, they were still in the fight. If you found this story of courage and engineering incredible, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from history. Thanks for watching. To be the target, flying through a dark sky with enemies closing in from all sides. Let's step back in time, into the cockpit of a Vickers Wellington bomber, one of the unsung heroes of World War II. Our pilot, let's call him Ward, is about to face the fight of his life. The night is shattered by the sudden rattle of machine gun fire. The first burst tears across the Wellington's tail, ripping through the fabric skin like a drum roll of death. Ward feels the entire aircraft shudder, not from breaking apart, but from the raw kinetic shock of dozens of bullets hitting at once. His navigator glances up from his charts, his eyes wide as he sees new constellations of starlight appearing through a fresh row of holes in the fuselage. But the German pilot in the Messerschmitt Bf-110 has made a crucial error. He opened fire too soon, from too far away. He's wasting precious ammunition while Ward is already wrestling with the controls, throwing the heavy bomber into a violent, evasive corkscrew. People often underestimated the Wellington. It was slow, sure, but it could turn tighter than many fighters expected. Ward yanks back on the control column, pointing the bomber's nose to the stars, standing it almost on its tail. This aggressive maneuver bleeds speed rapidly, forcing the faster Messerschmitt to overshoot. The fighter screams past a dark shadow against the moonlit clouds before breaking off to regroup for another attack. A 40-second reprieve. Just enough time to catch a breath, but not enough to feel safe. The calm is broken by a second hunter. Another Bf-110, this one from a different squadron, dives from a higher altitude. This pilot is no amateur. He's patient, closing the distance with deadly precision. He waits until he's just 300 yards away point-blank range in air combat before unleashing hell. This time, the attack is devastating. The concentrated burst of cannon and machine gun fire slams into the Wellington. 20mm cannon shells explode against the bomber's unique geodetic airframe, showering the inside of the fuselage with white-hot fragments of metal alloy. Their shells don't just explode. They burst in terrifyingly precise patterns, creating lethal cubes of flying shrapnel in the sky, designed to shred anything caught within them. 3 bursts detonate perilously close. The Wellington is hammered by a storm of steel fragments. Each explosion sends powerful shock waves slamming into the aircraft, hitting it like invisible fists, making it buck and yaw violently. Ward's eyes dart across his instrument panel. It's a picture of pure chaos. The airspeed indicator is jumping all over the place, probably a severed pitot line. The oil pressure gauge for the port engine dips alarmingly, then stabilizes, suggesting the damage is external, not a fatal engine failure. The compass is spinning uselessly. They are flying blind. Yet, despite the chaos on the dials, the aircraft itself feels okay. Ward can feel it through the controls, through the seat of his pants. The controls are still responsive. There's no worsening vibration, no terrifying roll that signals a wing is about to tear off. The bomber isn't falling apart. The secret to this incredible survival lies in the Wellington's revolutionary design. The wireless operator, sitting in the widest part of the fuselage, has a front row seat to this miracle of engineering. He can literally watch bullets and cannon shells enter one side of the aircraft and exit the other, passing straight through the empty diamonds of the geodetic lattice structure without hitting anything vital. One round rips through his desk, shattering the wood. Another punches cleanly through his parachute pack right next to him. He quickly counts 17 holes within arm's reach, the torn fabric flapping madly in the slipstream. And yet the Wellington flies on battered, perforated and bleeding fuel. It holds its altitude, a testament to its incredible toughness. The geodetic design, created by the brilliant Barnes-Vollis, wasn't just strong, it was redundant. It could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment and keep going, while other bombers might have disintegrated under such a ferocious attack. The Wimpy, as it was affectionately known, was a survivor. It could take a beating that would have sent almost any other aircraft spiraling to the ground. But this ability to endure was more than just a technical achievement. It was a lifeline for the thousands of young men who flew them night after night into the heart of enemy territory. It gave them a fighting chance, a glimmer of hope that they might just make it home. The story of Ward S. Wellington is the story of every crew that put their faith in that strange basket-weave airframe. It's a story of terror, courage, and incredible resilience. It's amazing to think about the sheer bravery of these crews, flying what was essentially a fabric-covered cage through a sky filled with fighters and flak, trusting their lives to its unique design. What do you think is the most impressive feat of wartime engineering? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story of survival, don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible tales from history. See you next time, in the dead of night, high over enemy territory. A lone Vickers Wellington bomber, piloted by a man named Ward, found itself in a desperate fight for survival. A German night fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf 110, swooped in, its guns blazing. The first attack was swift and brutal. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds tore into the Wellington's fuselage, ripping through the fabric skin and shattering internal components. The German pilot, confident in his deadly work, pulled away, expecting to see the bomber plummet from the sky in a fiery death spiral. He had seen it happen many times before. A few moments later, he returned for the kill. Swooping in from the port quarter, the Bf 110 pilot unleashed another 2-second burst. That's around 120 high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds slamming into the bomber. He watched with a professional SI as tracer rounds stitched a fiery line across the aircraft S-body. Fabric panels were torn into fluttering ribbons, and fragments of the bomber's structure spun off into the darkness. In his mind, the outcome was certain. He would later file his combat report, confidently claiming another Wellington destroyed. No aircraft he had ever encountered could absorb that much punishment and possibly remain airborne. It was a simple, brutal law of aerial combat. This was the geodetic or geodesic construction. Imagine a spider web. If you cut 1 or 2 strands, the web doesn't collapse. The tension and the load are instantly redistributed across the remaining threads. The web might sag a little, it might look damaged, but its overall integrity holds. This was precisely the principle behind the Wellington's airframe. Each time a German cannon shell blasted through a structural member, the immense aerodynamic forces that the beam had been carrying were immediately and automatically shifted to the surrounding network of interconnected struts. Damage could accumulate. Holes could be punched clear through the aircraft, but the plane as a whole refused to break apart. The Wellington's fuselage was essentially a lightweight but incredibly strong cage covered by a simple fabric skin. This fabric could be torn to shreds, as it was on Ward's bomber, without compromising the structural strength of the aircraft itself. The vital systems, the crew, the engines, the controls were protected within this resilient lattice. This design gave the Wellington an almost legendary ability to absorb damage that would have disintegrated other bombers. Stories from Bomber Command are filled with accounts of Wimpies, as they were affectionately known, returning to base with huge sections of their fuselage missing, looking more like skeletons than aircraft, yet still flying. Back in the skies over Germany, the second German pilot in the attacking formation also noticed something strange. He had watched his comrade pour fire into the British bomber, and yet it flew on. This wasn't normal. He moved in to attack, his own guns spitting fire. More rounds slammed into the already battered airframe. The damage was now horrific. The Wellington was riddled with holes, its internal structure exposed to the freezing night air. But still, it held together. The geodetic frame was taking a beating, but it wasn't breaking. The load was shifting, redistributing, the spiderweb holding firm even as more and more strands were cut. For the crew inside, it was a terrifying ordeal. They heard the deafening roar of the cannons, the sickening thud of shells striking their aircraft, and the whistle of the wind tearing through the gaping holes in the fuselage. They were exposed, vulnerable, and miles from home. Yet their machine, their trusted Wimpy, was keeping them in the air. The engines droned on, the controls still responded, and the wings, also built with the same geodetic principle, maintained their lift. They were flying a sieve, a skeleton, but they were flying. The German pilots, likely low on fuel and ammunition, and utterly perplexed by this ghost plane that refused to fall, eventually broke off their attack and disappeared into the night, against all odds. Ward and his crew nursed their shattered bomber back across the North Sea. They landed back at their base in England, presenting a sight that astonished the ground crews. The aircraft was a wreck. It was so full of holes that it looked like it should have fallen apart in mid-air. But there it was, sitting on the runway, its crew shaken, but safe. This single incident, and countless others like it, cemented the Wellington's reputation. It might not have been the fastest or the highest flying bomber, but it was tough, incredibly tough. It was an aircraft that brought its crews home.